Doc Discussions with Dr. Jason Edwards, brought to you by St. Luke's, St. Louis.
Hello, this is Jason Edwards, and this is Doc Discussions. I'm here with Emily Rosencrans. Emily, you're the head of pastoral care here at St. Luke's, is that right?
I'm the director of spiritual care services here, yes.
Very good, very good. Before we start the podcast, I want to acknowledge that there are heightened tensions in the United States right now for a lot of reasons. You have financial stress with many months of higher prices due to inflation, but you also have a lot of political turmoil in the country. And I don't want to get too deep into the details of that because, first of all, I won't be effective at that, and there are plenty other places to go for that. But as a doctor, I'm here to talk to our audience with you to help me about how we can navigate these challenging times to optimize our mental and emotional health as we move forward through this period of time. I think we have a compulsion as human beings to find out what's going on and what the news is. But with news being so ever present and so readily available, I think it can easily get to a point where it can be overwhelming and it can kind of take up your resources that you need to deal with the other vicissitudes of life. What have you found to be helpful for people when they're going through a difficult time?
First of all, to acknowledge how the news impacts us. I tell my chaplains, when something is big in the news, especially hot button issues, if there's something that is getting strong reactions in very different ways, you're going to see that in patient rooms. They're going to be watching the news. It's going to be impacting them deeply. Something traumatic is going to stir up their trauma history. Something political, if they agree with it, they're going to be happy. If they don't, they might be filled with rage. And sometimes being able to then talk to patients about maybe it's time to turn on the care channel, to turn on a chapel music and do something that might be more restorative.
Yeah.
Very often I will ask patients, what's going on in your life outside of being in the hospital? And there's a huge correlation between the stress in people's lives and what brought them to the hospital. Our bodies break down when we're enduring and suffering in other ways.
Yeah.
Fascinating to me that in every case where I have encountered someone with like Takotsubo syndrome, broken heart syndrome, it's a physical problem. It's rare. But when I say, do you have a broken heart? They say, yeah. So the physical can manifest itself in ways that is a metaphor for how we are emotionally and spiritually.
Yeah, actually, and that's a good point that you bring up. We discussed this with our episode with Jonas Cooper, our cardiologist, about Takotsubo syndrome, and this is when I think it's like a one-time issue, but I'm sure it can build upon itself as well, that ultimately results in a dysfunction of the heart, a cardiomyopathy. I think it's a dilated cardiomyopathy. I could be wrong on that. And but you have physical symptoms. And I think, with this political stuff and stuff that's on the news, I think people probably underestimate how much of an effect that can have on their overall energy level. Because I think when you're looking at the news and you're consuming this stuff, you would be shocked at how much energy you're wasting, or not wasting necessarily, but using by consuming this. And you are kind of, when you wake up every day, you have a finite amount of physical energy and emotional energy to expend. And so it's it just can be difficult to deal with these other things that you have to do in life that can be very important and very stressful when you overconsume or overindulge in some of these things, even though they're very important things. You know, I'm not saying it's not important, and I'm not saying it's not important to know about it, but you have to, I think it's important to modulate what you take in, because it can have an impact on the short term or long term on you and your health and the people around you. And
it can, the same things that can be stressful can also feed our spirits. So I found during COVID, the number of people who turned to online church services for inspiration, being able to watch Hamilton free of charge from your home. I watch the Hallmark Channel to de-stress. And I've told people it's not because of the plots. The plots are obviously predictable and simple. It's because I enjoy watching the way people work through issues and problems in a healthy way, because we don't always see that in life. And so to see people giving us an example of, well, here's how to work through a relational issue in a healthy way, and here's when to walk away from a relationship. I think there are certain things we can choose to watch that can actually have health benefits. And there are things on the news that are very not, by and large, news has a tendency to bring up the negative things, but there are also things that are that help the human spirit.
Yeah. Some news programs will finish with a segment that's kind of uplifting after they've kind of beaten you over the head for 25 minutes.
Or speeches during a national convention can be very inspiring, can help to galvanize people around important issues, make us realize we're part of something bigger than ourselves. So I think it's being a very informed and aware consumer and trying to make healthy choices.
Yeah. So there's this practice called mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and or just the kind of general sense of mindfulness. And I would kind of loosely define that as taking stock of like how you feel mentally and physically throughout the day. And if you feel you're tense, maybe take some time to go for a walk or take a few breaths or say a prayer or do something to kind of relax through the day and not be so tense. It's kind of like a pop-off valve to just let the pressure out and then continue on with your day. And there are many forms of this. There are special classes that you can take with experts and things like that. But there's good data showing that this improves anxiety and many aspects of quality of life. And so I think that in general, thinking about mindfulness and kind of considering where you're at, even if you're doing good, I mean, that's the time to stay in a good spot. But I'm fearful that this is going to cause a lot of distress in a lot of the country's lives. And I think if we can kind of stay ahead of this or modulate how you're doing throughout this process, you're going to be better off.
Throughout what process?
Well, throughout, I think, specifically, I'm talking about the assassination attempt on the former President Trump. I think that's kind of why I wanted to talk about this. And I think that, and then in general, there's going to be this election process. And some people, half the country is going to be happy and half the country is not going to be happy. And that's a lot of people. And so if we can move the dial just a little bit for some of those people, I think that, collectively that would be good.
So I have certification in mindfulness-based stress reduction. I think you do too, right?
I do not actually.
Okay. Yeah. I thought you were trained in that. I think it's very, very valuable to do things to help tune into our bodies, pay attention to our bodies, minds, spirits, emotions. I was raised in a military family, and to be a good Marine, you don't really share your feelings. My dad was actually in the Air Force, but by the time I was 7 or 8 years old, I didn't even have words for feelings. I knew how to be a good girl, how to do what I was expected to do. And it wasn't until I had chaplaincy training that I learned how to connect to my heart again. I was very strong intellectually, strong academically, and knew how to work in that world. But the first time my CPE supervisor, that's chaplaincy speak, said, "How do you feel about that?" I couldn't find a word. I had to relearn the language of the heart, mad, sad, glad. I think part of it in dealing, and I actually preached about this Sunday in light of, my sermon was based on the gospel text for the week, and I was preaching about vulnerability, but I did mention the assassination attempt, and what I spoke about in terms of vulnerability is I gave examples of what it means to be vulnerable. I brought a book with me. I'll just share some of these examples. This is from Brene Brown. She's a great, great writer. And in her section about vulnerability, she said it's the emotion we experience during times of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And in all of her research, she asked people, give examples of vulnerability. And I love these. She said, the first date after my divorce, talking about race with my team, trying to get pregnant after my second miscarriage, talking about my feelings, starting my own business, watching my child leave for college. So I gave all the ones that she gives. She has more. And then I said, being at a political rally and hearing shots fired, being a member of the family who was just shot, or watching someone be shot who's at the podium. That's vulnerable. And what I talked about was how we need to show up for our feelings. We need to be authentic and genuine and be there for ourselves. We can't go around them, over them, under them. When we do, it comes out sideways. But to be honest and honor our feelings. So do I expect people to be impacted by what happened over the weekend? Absolutely. For me, shock, sadness, that sense of here we go again from history, all the questions you ask, which never have answers. There is never an answer to why that makes sense.
Sure.
And I think staying in that place of realizing how vulnerable we are.
Welcome back to Doc Discussions with Dr. Jason Edwards. Medical news you can use, no appointment necessary.
So you say to kind of lean into some of these feelings. Sometimes I think there's value in that. Certainly, you want to be kind of honest with where you're at. Mm-hmm. Do you think you can lean into feelings too far and like overdo it? Do you think that ever happens?
I'm trained as a marriage and family therapist, and what I truly believe is if we lean in deeply and honor our feelings, we move through them and we heal. It's when we don't, or that is truncated, that there are problems. I'll give a story about that.
Okay.
Early in my ministry, my husband served a small country church, and there was a young couple expecting triplets, spontaneous. They were pregnant with triplets. In that family, a generation before, an aunt and uncle had also been expecting triplets. The aunt and uncle lost the triplets at 20 weeks. They didn't survive. They were told, first of all, they put her under when she went into delivery. They did not tell her whether they were male or female, whether they, anything about them. They didn't see the babies. They didn't name them. There was nothing to honor what had just happened. They were told to go home and pretend it never happened. And that led to all sorts of issues.
Sure.
Substance abuse, depression, you can imagine. The same thing happened in the current generation. Better resources medically, but they lost the babies at 20 weeks. The difference was the hospital knew to rally around them. There was a chaplain, there's a social worker, they have burial plans. They tell them to look at their babies, name their babies, celebrate their short lives. And there was a church service. People came. Because they were allowed to grieve, they moved past it in a really healthy way. So can we get stuck? Yes. And not move through things? Absolutely. Can we be unhealthy in the way we have just keep perseverating, ruminate on things? Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think we need to ask ourselves, why am I doing this? Do I need help?
Yeah.
But most of the time, it's if we truly honor our feelings, we move through them and we heal.
Yeah.
So it's a balance.
Yeah, I think so. That's what I've kind of found just like talking to a lot of patients who have cancer is that you need, the first example was like 0 out of 100, and then the second was like they got a good healthy dose of support and were able to kind of work their way through the process.
Yeah.
And then sometimes you can see where it is too much, where sometimes it can be a big deal or not a big deal. But somebody, like you said, that's a good word, gets stuck on it. They just get stuck, and they always, to me, it's like they go to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and they didn't have to go to the bottom.
Yeah.
They just had to go in a little bit, but they ruminate on it, and now there's an opportunity cost that develops where you're living here and life is passing you by, and you're not able to. And then I think that's where you need medicine and things like that a lot of times, and professional help.
Absolutely.
I am a big fan of trying to do some of these non-pharmacological things first. And there's actually a few studies that show that whether it's mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy or exercise, even singing, so I would say to try to calm your mind down and to seek beauty. It would be kind of a simple way of saying all these things. Exercise is under the calm your mind down category. Can be very powerful, and oftentimes what I've seen is it can be a better long-term solution than medicine. But certainly if you get to a point where you can't quote unquote pull yourself up by your bootstraps and do some things like this, then for sure reach out, and there's no shame in it. And I think over the last 20 years, that's really changed a lot. There's people have way less shame in starting an antidepressant or something like that.
And as chaplains, we're trained in offering non-pharmacological ways to relieve stress and pain.
Yeah.
And I've even worked with CEO type individuals who I walk in and say, well, would you like to know some other ways to handle the pain you're in? And at first they're skeptical.
Sure.
And then, doing hand massages, guided imagery work, teaching people that something that, anxiety begets pain, which begets more pain. So working on anxiety. And one of the things people don't always know is that when we are perseverating on something, do something with your hands. When you work with your hands, it allows the mind to process those things we're getting stuck on. So my mother, when she was grieving the loss of her husband, it was her second husband, a 30-year marriage, and she was in the depths. And I gave her coloring books and crayons, and I said, I prescribed.
Yeah.
I said, I want you to color for 1 hour a day. And my mom's a rule follower, so she colored for 1 hour a day. And she said, I don't know what that was, but I would sit there and make myself 10 to 11 every day. I would color, And I felt better, and
Yeah.
I wasn't crying as much. So I tell people, whether it's needlework, it can be music. Todd is a musician, and if you're playing an instrument, if you're doing woodworking, have a hobby, anything we do with our hands releases mental tension.
I've had actually several patients who say, I do these adult coloring books. And let's be real. The first time you hear that, you're like, what? Like, what?
I know.
And so, but if you, as silly as this may be, let's unpack that a little bit. So you're doing something other than ruminating on your problems.
Exactly.
Okay. You're focusing on something. You're moving your body. You're using your mind. You are embarking on a challenge, although it's not a gigantic challenge. And then at the end, you make something that you can look at and you can say, you know what? I'm proud of that. And that might sound silly. You might think that's not true. But every time I mow my yard, I look at my yard and I say, you know what? I just did that. And plenty of people out there who mow their yard will have that same sense. And maybe later on in the day, you'll go look at the yard and say, yeah, my yard looks good. I did that. And it's not that much different than
when I make a beautiful meal.
Yeah.
I think, wow,
Action.
Yeah.
Do something. Don't sit there and let your mind work against you. And I always tell patients, if you can work as we go through your cancer treatment, work. Because sometimes your mind works for you, but most of the time it works against you. And, as they say, an idle mind is the devil's workshop. And, grandma wasn't too far off on that one.
I agree. And we know that keeping mentally and physically active is so good for our brains, and especially as we age.
Yeah. I've said this before. I think walking is so good for your mind. It's good for your body, but it's way better for your mind, and it's almost meditative. I mean, you are meant to walk as a human being. And so I think walking, prayer, listening to beautiful music, talking to friends, writing a letter to a friend, these are all things that you can do.
Pet therapy.
Oh, I don't know what that. I'm sure I could go into the AI engine or the Google engine and find all kinds of articles showing that. I know it decreases your blood pressure, and I'm sure it turns the mind down a few notches. And so I think we shouldn't ruminate on these things that we see in the news. It's good to consume them to some degree so you know what's going on. Maybe, but you can't live there, and you can't look at the tail ends of the bell curve and extrapolate that, these rare things, these rare events in life, and extrapolate that out to the rest of humanity. But, they're not going to show me saying hi to somebody in a hallway on the news. They're only going to show the tail ends of the bell curve, the ultra rare events, because otherwise they're not noteworthy. But if that's all you see, you start to assume that the whole world is like that.
I'm sure you've seen that somehow in the last 20, maybe 40 years, we've begun to think the world is a more dangerous place because we see news around the clock.
Yeah.
And actually the world is not more dangerous than it was before. We just see it, hear it, talk about it, digest it more. I grew up during the Vietnamese War, and you turn on the news, then you sit down to eat dinner, and there's war behind you all the time.
1968 was not a great year.
It's not normal to be, sitting down to dinner watching people die in the background every single day. So not that we watched the news as we ate dinner, but it was that ever presence of we're at war. And so there, moderation and everything, including moderation.
I agree 100%. And I think there's a book called The Rational Optimist, which I think would be really great for everybody to at least read a summary of. And you see how, in a general sense, from decade to decade to decade, if you look at the past, 500 decades, things have only gotten better. They've only gotten better in every measurable metric. Is there going to be a tough year here and there? For sure. For sure. It's not linear, but in general, things will only get better. I'd like to tell a quick story here. And I think an essential part of if you're having trouble mentally and emotionally is hope. I think you need hope for the future. And in the 1940s in Japan, the country was in utter devastation after World War II. Major cities, Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagasaki were all in rubble due to extensive bombing. Over 2.5 million Japanese had died. Industrial production had fallen to less than 10% of its pre-war levels. There was a severe food shortage. I think the number was like 700 to 800 calories per person. And so inflation was rampant, rising 500% in 1946 alone. And nobody could have predicted that Japan would turn that around and become the world's second biggest non-communist economy in the world by the late 80s. I mean, Japan was probably doing better than the majority of European countries and almost as good as America, and, out of rubble. And there's a million stories like that, but it's important to have hope that not only things get better in your life, but things get better in the world, that they get better in the United States. And I think it's our duty to have some hope for the future. You do have some control over the thoughts in your mind, and you should take control of that. And if you want to have a good life, try to have a good day today. And you're not going to be able to do that without a little bit of hope.
Yeah. So extreme political rhetoric says if you vote for this person, the world is coming to an end. On both sides, on all sides. And that's not true. And you're right that having hope, I mean, I'm a Christian, I'm in the spiritual care realm. I know that people struggle mightily, suffer incredibly. What gets us through is having a sense of a light at the end of the tunnel, having a sense that the sun is going to come out tomorrow, looking at the people who love us and the people we love, and realizing there are reasons to go on. And every generation has challenges, but we also seem to rise above them. And I am a real believer in the power of the human spirit to overcome. So, yeah, hope is essential.
Emily, thanks so much for your time. I've really enjoyed speaking to you, and I can tell you've got a big heart and a wealth of experience, and we're lucky to have you here.
Thank you.
All right. Tune in next week for our next episode of Doc Discussions. Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Doc Discussions with Dr. Jason Edwards. Be sure to check out our other episodes and tell your friends.